Good evening and welcome. Welcome to this land, to this space, to this little piece of the planet that's so close to home for some of you, but perhaps very far away to many others. The weather is always like this, by the way, in case you're visiting from afar. And I hope you enjoy this visit to Seattle in this evening. A number of you are joining us online. Some of you who are present here are here in the interest of CEU credits. There's a barcode on the table. If that's you, feel free to scan those in. This is a psychological humanities lecture, and that means that we have a lecturer here to help us think deeply about psychology and the humanities. And it also begins a weekend together for the Cura Psychologia program, a Templeton-funded program that 6 different Jesuit Catholic schools are participating in. There's faculty from each of those schools here, 3 from each of those 6 schools joining for our work together in interdisciplinary work over the next 3 days. I'm Eric Severson. I'm a philosopher here at Seattle U, and I'm honored to be one of 2 senior instructors in the Cura Psychologia program, sponsored by Templeton. And the other is Donna Orange, who happens to be our speaker tonight, our special featured speaker. I'll say a little more about Donna momentarily. We are thankful for the generosity of Seattle University for claiming as its own this gathering and this convening of faculty for this program. And I thank you for traveling from afar, those of you who have joined us via CTAC today and in recent days. It's good to converge in person and good to see you all. The faculty that are here for the Cura Psychologia program, and I think you'll find this is a fire beneath Donna's talk this evening, are all interested with wrestling with the electric and delicate interdisciplinary space where psychology and philosophy and theology converge. I think you'll get a strong taste of that this evening, both through the lecture and through the respondents. These are people gathered here to speak with you and then to speak over the next few days who refuse those neat and clean and poisonous boundaries that separate disciplines and frequently isolate our work from one another. Each of these speakers tonight draw deep energy and creativity from interdisciplinary thinking, so you're in for a treat tonight. Before introducing Dr. Orange, I want to open with a word of gratitude for the air and water and land and nourishment that we enjoy together in this place. The act of expressing gratitude, acknowledging the deep history of this land and its first peoples, is no formality. Regularly acknowledging respect and reverence for the Coast Salish peoples, modern and ancestral, is a formational ritual. This gratitude shapes the responsibility that we carry for this land, for the burdens and damages wrought by settler colonialism here, and for Indigenous peoples who remain among the most vulnerable members of our society today. This vulnerability manifests itself in our hospitals, where healthcare outcomes are sharply lower for Indigenous persons, but also in our schools and streets and laboratories and businesses and social groups. A land acknowledgement isn't really a historical statement about the unceded and stolen places where we live and think and meet, though it is that. A land acknowledgement is more principally a responsibility acknowledgement. One great gift from local Indigenous thinkers is that reframing of responsibility. To a culture that is responsibility averse, that tends to think about responsibility as a burden, Coast Salish leaders offer an alternative account. Responsibility for the land, for one another, for vulnerable people, for animals, for water, is not an impediment to living well, but the very opportunity to do so. It is the hollowest and thinnest form of human existence, the one without responsibility. This rethinking of responsibility, of radical ethics, of connection and dependency and solidarity with one another, is the antidote to the separation and isolation created by the individualism that fuels colonialism, white supremacy, and a wide range of oppressive forces in this space and so many others. Our featured speaker this evening, Dr. Donna Orange, has for decades offered this antidote to psychologists and philosophers and anyone else who would listen. It has been some years since she was on faculty here at Seattle University, though we'd be quick to take her back. and are quick to take credit for her remarkable and influential career in the decades since she taught philosophy here. Donna is a versatile and compelling teacher, a psychoanalyst, a philosopher, a prolific author, and an award-winning bicycle racer who won a bicycle race yesterday. I was just told when we hugged each other this evening. She's also a mentor and a friend to me, a person whose work has inspired in me a productive irreverence. She doesn't give a damn about the boundaries some might place between academic disciplines and proceeds to vividly demonstrate that clinicians can be thinkers, that philosophers should and must care about holistic well-being, that all of us must nourish the inner life that makes possible the difficult work of caring for suffering others. I could talk about her all night, but perhaps it would be better if I let her speak. The title of her talk this evening is We Shall Be Change, Radical Ethics for the Humanistic Disciplines. Thank you for joining us this evening, Donna. The mic is yours.
Thank you ever so much, Eric, and thank you all for those who were involved in inviting me. That's amazing. It's quite astonishing to be back here at Seattle University, where I last was teaching here 41 years ago in the philosophy department. Before I went to New York and to Yeshiva University and became Jewish and became a psychoanalyst. So you never know what Seattle U might do to you. You know, Eric, however, has missed his elementary lessons in ethics, having lied about the weather already. When I first came to Seattle, I had been told that there were mountains all around here, and I just never saw them. So I decided that they made that up, that this was a legend about Seattle, that there were mountains to see. In any case, the other thing I want to tell you before I start is that I am completely deaf in one ear, and that's why I'm wearing a cochlear implant. But if I don't respond to you, especially when we're around in different situations, please come around and talk into my good ear. I'm not ignoring you, I just don't hear you. So thank you for that. I don't want people to feel that I don't care, as you will know as you hear me talk. Probably it makes sense to explain at the outset why we are here this evening at an event organized by participants in the Cura Psychologia project, even before telling you what a pleasure and honor it is to be here in my old haunt, 1978 to 82, where I got my start teaching philosophy in the days when women were even scarcer in philosophy than they had been during my graduate studies at Fordham. I should take a moment to welcome my student from Duquesne, who is Jen Heyman, who's here, who I may not have pronounced that right, because that's an interdisciplinary program that I would have loved to study in, and I was very, very privileged to teach Husserl there a few years ago. In any case, we are here now because we members of this project believe in interdisciplinary conversation, in deepening the dialogue, starting with Jesuit universities, among psychologists, theologians, and philosophers. By finding our shared history and concerns, we hope to reground all three disciplines in the humanities. But there are obstacles. Each discipline seeks truth in its own way, works by its own methods, carries a fair amount of disdain for the others, and tends, by way of academic departmentalization, to isolate itself, building not a single ivory tower, but a whole collection of them. Tonight, we invite you to join our working group in considering what makes a good human being, a question Aristotle first posed for Western philosophy in an organized manner in the Nicomachean Ethics. To be sure, Socrates had already placed ethics as the foundation of philosophical thinking. But Aristotle, later dear to medieval theology, gave us more precision as to what constitutes human well-being, eudaimonia he called it. He described virtue as consisting in moderation, in finding the so-called golden mean between the two extremes to which we often resort under pressure and without deliberation. Perhaps his most famous example, courage stands at the moderate point between cowardice and rashness. In addition, his ethics includes a careful catalog of the virtues proper to a good human life: prudence, justice, fortitude or courage, and temperance. He concludes with his famous treatise on friendship, crucial component of a good human life. Yes, most of us studied all this in our school and university years. So why do we begin with Aristotle now? For at least two reasons. The question of human well-being remains central to all three disciplines involved in this project, as well as to Jesuit education generally. And two, because Aristotle, though the first to systematize an answer to the question of the good human life, has surely not been the last. From medieval theology through the rationalist and calculative ethics of the modern period, to the separation of psychology from philosophy more recently, new answers, religious, philosophical, and psychological, have dominated. Does good human living consist in submission to the divine? However that may be conceived in various traditions. Is goodness a matter of the moral law within, as Kant said, to be approached through reason, or perhaps through a calculus of goods and evils, benefits and risks, as we find in the utilitarians, now called consequentialists? Does the virtuous person refer to an egoism characteristic of Western modernity generally, focused on Pascal's single individual for whom, quote, my place in the sun is the destruction of the earth? This individualism, updated by Kant and the utilitarians, long seemed fully compatible with colonialism and enslavement, and now justifies oppression and privilege. Individualism believed the two philosophers of radical ethics we consider tonight made possible the horrors of the World War II era, and a lot of other things. Knud Eiler Løgstrup, that's L-O-G-S-T-R-U-P with a slash through the O. And the Danish friend told me that that was the right way to say it, but I wouldn't know. Knud Eiler Løgstrup, perhaps the most important Danish philosopher since Kierkegaard. Løgstrup was born in 1905, lived through the Nazi occupation of Denmark, taught philosophy and theology at the University of Aarhus, and died in 1981. His magnum opus, translated into English as The Ethical Demand, and I'm sorry I didn't have room in my suitcase to bring some of the books that I'm going to speak about. His magnum opus claims that the impossible command to love one's neighbor, as heard in Christianity, need not be linked to institutional religion or dogma, but instead must be understood humanly as silent, radical, one-sided, and impossible. These are the four characteristics of the ethical demand in his view: silent, radical, one-sided, and impossible. He believed that the basic phenomenological fact of human trust in each other, absent abuse of this trust, means that our lives come to us as a gift and that we have a fundamental duty to take care of each other. He wrote of utter vulnerability, quote, "The other person must be to such a degree dependent upon me that what I do and say in the relationship between us, I alone and nobody else, here and now and not at some other time or in some other manner, is of decisive importance. If my relation to the other person is the place where my relation to God is determined, then it must at the same time be the place where that person's existence is so totally at stake that to fail them is to fail them irreparably." Immediately, we hear an unusual voice, clear, straightforward, uncompromising, without philosophical or theological jargon. Lloydstrup addresses me by saying, "I am involved. The other person is at my mercy." Let's look more closely. He called the ethical demand silent because it comes to us without words in two senses. Unspoken, but implicit in all conversation, the other's dependence on me means I must not mistreat or abandon this raw vulnerability. I often think of this as a clinician, how vulnerable people make themselves when they come to us for help. I used to say often that they place their souls in our hands before I read this, and it's kind of the same idea. Regardless, he wrote, of how varied the communication between persons may be, it always involves the risk of one person daring to lay himself or herself open to the other in the hope of a response. The silent demand, though it commands response, does not specify exactly what must be done, but leaves each of us to work that out. Like the humanitarians, among these we could mention doctors, nurses, teachers, social workers, and so on, to whom we may recommend both Lloydstrup and Levinas, the recipient of the demand must find the demand's content in the specific context. An ethical response, one that takes care of the vulnerability of the other, differs depending on the age of the child, the illness and capacities of the patient, the resources of the surrounding world, and the precarity Judith Butler's work foregrounds. Precarity in her terms means fragility, vulnerability, the tendency to be regarded as ungrievable, not a human life worth mourning. The demand remains silent on its content, but it does not permit or exonerate bystanding. Though the ethical demand remains silent and pervasively implicit, still Lloydstrup insists on its radicality, the second of the four qualities. Its radicality not in words and actions, but in the demand itself. This ethics requires that what I do and say in relation to the other be done unselfishly. Oh my God. For the sake of the other. He wrote, the demand, precisely because it is unspoken, is radical. This is true even though the thing to be done in any particular situation may be very insignificant. Why is this? Because the person confronted by the unspoken demand must determine how they are to take care of the other person's life. If what they do is to result in something of real value to the other person, they must think and act unselfishly, he wrote. The response demanded may be small and seem insignificant, but just think of the way, for example, you see someone that looks a little bit lonely and you either walk over to them and say, "How you doing?" or you give them a big smile because you're in a big, it seems insignificant, and it's part of radical ethics. It's definitely an expression of that. We can remember from our clinical work that the patient remembers something we did or said that seemed to us routine or minor. If we responded unselfishly or open-heartedly to the ethical demand, to the abandoned or precarious patient, this moment may take on infinite significance in the life of the patient or in the therapeutic relationship. And I'm thinking of a story that I'll tell you quite briefly. I had a patient for years when I was still working in clinical practice who had a terrible disfiguring scleroderma from which she was certainly going to die, but in the meantime, it was unbelievably painful, and so were all the treatments for it. Thus, she had been an outstanding folk singer and guitarist, and she could no longer, her fingers were so distorted that she couldn't do at all. I mean, it was just, so she came and just, it wasn't entirely clear to me what she came in for, but she told me about her family, and she told me about the treatments and the misery and the this and the that for 7 years. And I would help her get her coat up unzipped and help her get a coat zipped up again in the winter cold in New York, help her get her shoes off, help her get her shoes back on, get boots back on, tie her shoes, you know, all of the kinds of things that they tell psychoanalysts not to do. But I never thought much about it. It was just what needed to be done. It was just whatever needed to be done. After 7 years, she came in one day and said, "I'm done now. I'm finished." And I was quite surprised because I hadn't seen this coming. And I said, "Well, why don't you come back next week and we'll say goodbye?" And she did. And we talked about, you know, what we had done together and all of this sort of thing. As she's getting up to leave, she said, "Thank you for helping me to accept my illness." And I want to tell you that we never once spoke about accepting her illness. We never did. It's what we think we're doing when we respond to the ethical demand, and what's actually going on is often a lot more and a lot different. And it was a big lesson for me. It really was. There's so little that I know. Some of you read my paper about fallibilism. Well, this is more of that. I don't know. I just don't know. Sometimes the demand upon me or its intrusion into my busy life seems enormous, but I may not walk away. I could tell you another story about that, but I don't have enough time to tell all the stories. The other person, perhaps my patient, depends upon me utterly in that moment. Finally, Loigstrup concludes, as if he had studied Levinas on the ethical constitution of subjectivity, quote, "The demand has the effect of making the person to whom the demand is directed a singular person." The ethical constitution of subjectivity. Ethically speaking, the demand isolates him or her. That is, it isolates me as the person to whom the command is directed. It's not to anybody else, and nobody else can replace me. I am it, if you will. I respond, therefore I am. Ego-centeredness must go as I surrender my own sense of possession and control. Moving beyond Aristotelian and all later ethical systems, a radical ethics replaces the normalizing of everyday character building and habit formation with self-deremption, self-emptying, not for its own sake to make me virtuous, but to make room for the other. It is not about me, but for the other. Loigstrup notes that we are not required to, quote, turn ourselves inside out to abandon all spiritual reticence. We are allowed to, now this is me again, indeed we must find time and resources to nourish our inner lives, whether meditation, spiritual reading, or liturgy, or bicycling, if only so that we can live out a radical ethics. We must protect the life of the other who has been delivered over into our hands. Loegstrup cautions that our responsibility for the other does not mean taking over the responsibility for the other's own responsibilities. He further cautions that mistaking radical responsibility for limitlessness can easily lead us to encroach on the other in the name of taking care. The radicality of the demand may require us to do less than radical actions. Besides being silent and radical, the demand is one-sided, asymmetrical, because it can claim nothing in return. If, as Loegstrup took as axiomatic, my life is a gift, I have nothing to which I am entitled. I possess nothing that I have not received and cannot, as he said, make counter demands. Levinas, to whom we turn later, would have said that seeing our lives as gift meant accepting that we are creatures, not self-made or lords of the universe. Both thinkers, it was always lords of the universe, not ladies. Both thinkers share a biblical and prophetic inspiration despite their different traditions. Some will object, Loegstrup knew, to characterizing life as a gift, especially in the face of suffering and death, loss and despair. But he concluded, the thing that makes us dispute that life is a gift is not death or suffering. It is our own will to be worshiped and to feel our own power. By characterizing life as a gift, he seems to mean unearned, and thus not grounding any sense of entitlement or priority of my life over that of the other. Quite the contrary. So the question of reciprocity, what does the other owe to me, receives almost the same answer from Loegstrup as from Levinas. That is his affair. My only concern is that the other comes first. The common or divergent sources of their convictions on this one-sidedness or asymmetry would make a larger study than I can undertake here. I suspect that Levinas, whose later work insists that we are passively born into an utterly persecutory and prior responsibility, took the more radical position. But both equally opposed any social contract ethics based on reciprocity or mutual recognition. These ideas can pretend to be humanistic, but they reduce ethics to an exchange economy. I've known people who are absolutely determined every time they receive a gift to give back something of equal value. And that reduces it to an exchange economy. It's no longer a real gift. Derrida was very good on this point. And last, the demand is impossible or unfulfillable because it so seems to contradict our acquired selfishness. Nobody can live so generously, you may say. The demand is further impossible because we can never know whether we have truly acted unselfishly. The demand does not tell us how we are to take care of the other. Sometimes the other would seem to be left in the rubble, but that we must take care. Nor can we know if we have done enough. Loegstrup acknowledges that the demand sometimes involves us in knotty problems of thinking we know better, like a parent, you know, the famous German Besserwisser, that we know better, like a parent, what is good for the other, but insists that these problems cannot allow us to become bystanders. The Good Samaritan is Loegstrup's model. The ethical demand does not prescribe what exactly we who observe injustice should do. It requires that we respond and leaves all the problems of practical wisdom to us. The needs are infinite and we are not. We thus live divided between the demand and our possibilities. He described a radical vulnerability into which we are born and in which we live. Trust, he wrote, is essential to every conversation. In conversation as such, we deliver ourselves over into the hand of the other. The minute I speak to you, I have placed myself in your hands. And this was a particular conviction of his. Parenthetically, we might note that misunderstandings and ruptures, therapeutic and in intimate relationships, occur when the other feels some important nuance unheard and trust breached. The silent demand is to protect trust, the precondition for everything. We protect and restore trust as best we can by the careful and receptive way we listen to the other, even when the other accuses us of not listening. And any of you who are clinicians, this is your daily bread and butter. It might be tempting to think that Lloydstrup denies moral complexity and the difficulty inherent in some situations. What he contests, I believe, is substituting endless deliberation and calculation for ethical response. In radical ethics, the commitment to respond to the other comes before and structures Aristotelian phronesis, practical wisdom. Patrick Stokes, an Australian scholar of Lloydstrup's work, says moral deliberation, a sort of phronetic practical wisdom, only comes into play once one has already implicitly and non-reflectively committed oneself to meet the ethical demand. So the Good Samaritan has committed himself to help, then he's got to figure out how. And that's kind of what the story is. But the difficulty of figuring out how doesn't get him off the hook for doing anything. Wisdom and prudence cannot serve as excuses for doing nothing, for leaving the stranger to die alone in the ditch. We are first responders. Ambiguity intended. Lloydstrup's ethical philosophy, like that of Emmanuel Levinas, with whom he begs to be compared, mostly emerged from his reflections on the behavior of bystanders and of courageous people during the Nazi period. He wrote of the differences, for example, in ethical decision required in Norway and Denmark during World War II. In Denmark, he thought the presence of a government that persisted between the people and the Nazis meant they had time for deliberation. In Norway, with nothing but Nazi government, people constantly faced radical choices where protecting the vulnerable meant immediate risk of death or concentration camp for themselves or their families. This meant, Lloydstrup thought, that their previous patterns of response to the ethical demand would probably predominate in their choice to collaborate, resist, or protect the lives of vulnerable others. And this is where the habitual story from the Aristotelians comes back into play, because we're always preparing ourselves. There is a psychic maturity, he wrote, which can make the direction of many an instant decision a foregone conclusion. Even where much is at stake, a person need not therefore necessarily be in doubt about what they will do. Although we may in our present moment still have time to deliberate, to sleep on it, I find it useful to realize that every choice I make may be preparing a direction for fiercer challenges. Lloydstrup himself, by the way, involved himself in much more courageous and dangerous resistance to the Nazi occupiers than many of his Danish colleagues were willing to do. Okay. Am I all right on the time? Okay. Another aspect of Lloydstrup's thinking helps to make his radicality clear. He raged as much as his reserved philosophical voice would let him, against Kierkegaard, dearly beloved ancestor of so many of us who grew up in the 60s and 70s with existentialism. In his view, Kierkegaard, putting away Regina Olsen and his love for her, focused too much on his own purity of heart. Others, of course, may view Kierkegaard differently or view these two as much closer. In Leukstrup's view, ethics has little to do with how holy and pure the individual can become. It's not about me. Instead, ethics means hearing the moans of the stranger in the ditch or begging on the street as addressed to me. Okay, now I'm going to talk about Leukstrup and Levinas together. And you'll think that Levinas gets short shrift, but I think a lot more of you know about him than about Leukstrup. But it's nice to know that there are two thinkers with different voices and different biblical sources that are bringing us a philosophy of radical ethics that turns out to be extremely similar. Emanuel Levinas, born in Lithuania in 1906, within a year of Leukstrup, student and early admirer of Heidegger, came to mount an ethical and phenomenological critique of what he called totalizing, every form of reducing people to things or categories, a tendency he found both violent and endemic to the Western tradition. From the time Hitler came to power, with Heidegger enthusiastically endorsing him, Levinas contrasted this murderous totalizing with response and responsibility toward infinity and transcendence, to the face of the other, commanding me, accusing me. Presentiment and memory of the Nazi horror, he wrote, haunted all his work. In his second great book, Otherwise Than Being, substitution, the other's life before mine, the other's death of more consequence and concern than mine, takes center stage. Ethical saying, hineni, me, here, yes, no, it's often translated as here I am, but there's no really I in there. It's me voici in French, and it's hineni in Hebrew, and those are the two languages he's thinking in here. It disrupts the objectifying, categorizing said, now treating the naked and vulnerable other as of ultimate value. Excuse me. The face of the other now bears the trace of the infinite, and only in the other, the widow, the orphan, the stranger, can the infinite be found and heard. So how do these two thinkers of radical ethics compare and contrast? Rooted in religion, Lutheran and Jewish, respectively, both intended to work as phenomenologists, but picked up different strains. Influenced by Bergson, Husserl, and Heidegger, both lived at the same time in the town of Strasbourg. They seem never to have met in the early 30s. And both Husserl and Heidegger were there at times in the early 30s. Heideggerian thrownness became for Leukstrup basic trust, only destroyed by betrayal and trauma. The basic trust exerts an almost instinctual hold. He justified his view of the ethical demand on grounds of experiences with which the reader or hearer could easily identify. He liked very much to tell stories so that you could get into his thinking. Levinas, directly Heidegger's student, but even earlier a translator and student of Husserl, found another phenomenological voice. The self is a subjectum, subjected. It is under the weight of the universe. What is incumbent on me from all sides regards me is my affair. Incumbent means already there, just like it does in politics. It already obligating me, holding me responsible. The already is before I even meet you. that I am already responsible. There's so much more to be said about that. I'll leave it to Eric to fill you in on a lot of the details. Here we find a prophetic voice challenging the whole philosophical tradition. The first person perspective, so beloved by phenomenologists, finds itself no longer agentic, no longer the agentic constructor of experience, but the subject as subjected, under the weight of incumbency, obligated from all sides, more passive than all passivity was one of his favorite expressions. Because Levinas outlived Loystrup into the digital age, we have an additional access to his distinctive voice in the form of interviews from his later years that you can get on YouTube, accessible to all of us. We can hear him repeat the importance of returning to texts, and like a mantra, la sortie du soi, la sortie du soi, the exit from self. The exit from self. Each thinker describes in his own idiom a radical ethical demand of responsibility to care for the vulnerable other. Phenomenologists both thinkers challenge what Simon Critchley calls the autonomy orthodoxy of Western moral theory. Both describe ethical experience rather than justifying ethical choices. Both, in addition, share a Hebrew and Christian sensibility, shaping their preference for the poor and the abandoned ones. Phenomenology gives both thinkers a secular language, one might say, for communicating their radical ethics in human terms. Levinas was raised in an intellectual strain of Judaism in Kovno, Lithuania, and ever allergic to Judaism's more mystical forms. He was then profoundly educated in Russian literature in exile in Ukraine in his gymnasium years, and in phenomenology in Europe with Husserl and Heidegger. Levinas emerged from 5 years in captivity during the war to study Talmud with the famous Chuchani, also the teacher of Elie Wiesel. Headmaster of a Jewish school in Paris, Levinas gave weekly Rashi commentaries, one of the most famous biblical commentators in the Talmudic tradition. Where did I leave off? And he produced Talmudic commentaries, and I just can't recommend those too highly. I absolutely love following him through that stuff. The quote from the Talmud will be something that just leaves you scratching your head. You know, God, this is crazy stuff. But he, within 20 pages, he's made some sense out of it, and he's linked it to radical ethics and to what's going on in Europe at that particular time. He published those with a different publisher, though, from his philosophical work. These, as well as his explicitly philosophical works, show a fascinating interdisciplinary voice with a strong resistance to theologizing. The Danish Lutheran Loystrup, for his part, began his best-known work, The Ethical Demand, by framing its purpose as making the basic message of Jesus, love thy neighbor, accessible in human terms. How many times should I forgive my brother? 70 times 70. A radical, one-sided, and unfulfillable demand like the Levinasian ethic, this inordinate, excessive demand seems to echo, be ye perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect. But Lloydstrom did not quote these words. Educated in theology and philosophy, he, like Levinas, avoided theologizing, preferring description and narrative of ethical experience. He knew we could not be perfect and relied on his Lutheran faith to believe that we are always already forgiven. The Christian message, he said, does not solely take into account what a person actually is, but also takes into account what a person is in the light of the message, a forgiven human being. The demand is impossible. It requires of forgiven sinners that we be perfectly good. Faith provides him not content, but context. He saw people living out their acceptance of the ethical demand in the present and struggling with it. Levinas would speak of a split in subjectivity, with the demand originating in the immemorial past, a demand to which I am always already inadequate, thus torn apart by it. In Judith Butler's straightforward words, let's face it, we're undone by each other. And if we're not, we're missing something. For both thinkers, Western religious sensibility grounded and shaped what they came to understand as the human ethical relation. How much either would be willing to or able to engage in interfaith dialogues beyond their partially shared traditions remains for me an open question. Both profoundly challenged the individualism underlying Western ontologies, colonialism, and other forms of reductive and murderous violence. Loigstrup substituted trust, Levinas solidarity. Both seem close to the Buddhist compassion and to African Ubuntu, though to my knowledge, neither mentioned these ideas. A striking similarity between these two thinkers, absent from other well-known moral philosophers, is one-sidedness or asymmetry. The ethical demand is on me, not you. This stupefying, excessive, exorbitant quality defies the logic of justification. Only stories demonstrate its possibility and even reasonableness. But I must mention that in his last years, Levinas tended to call these examples of ethical response holiness. Loigstrup, more reserved, thought they simply demonstrated true humanity. Perhaps these two labels are closer than they may sound. Despite the striking parallels, we find in Loigstrup an emphasis on human interdependence underpinning his constant talk of basic trust. For him, a phenomenological fundamental that finds no exact equivalent in Levinas, for whom an anarchic responsibility refuses all appeal to something foundational. But do they differ so much? Both stress one-sidedness and asymmetry, but the vulnerability of Loigstrup's speaker and the nakedness of the face of Levinas's widow, orphan, and stranger share a common fragility and impose a common demand. You shall not turn away. You shall not remain indifferent. You shall not murder me with your categories. You shall not leave me to die alone. To my ears, these messages from a Lutheran and a Jewish phenomenologist sound equally demanding. Others lacking such voices must turn to practical philosophers like Dorothy Day, for whom both Loigstrup and Levinas would have very well understood. Returning to where we began tonight, we should ask what has changed between Aristotelian and radical ethics. Despite Aristotle's insistence that we are naturally social as well as rational animals, his ethical focus remains the well-being, eudaimonia, of the individual. By contrast, radical ethics does not place the other first. It finds the other always already first. And by this shift in focus, we are changed. Here are some words that came to me in my last years of psychoanalytic practice. Allowing ourselves to be affected by our patient's suffering in a Levinasian spirit means trusting them to lead us within a complex dialogic process. It will lead us down paths we did not expect to go and change us profoundly. The trumpet shall sound, proclaims the basso in Handel's famous aria, and we shall be changed. In psychoanalysis, we may not hear the trumpet of theological expectation, but if we surrender ourselves to the intersubjective complexity into which our patients invite and challenge us, we will be profoundly changed. To tell a clinical story now, I must describe what both parties bring to the field, how complex and interdependent are the processes of mutual influence and asymmetric role responsibility. I must relate how both of us have been changed by each other and by the work, play, struggle we have done together. By you who walk through my door in the next hour with your unique need to be met and embraced, despite whatever I may bring that hinders or complicates my compassion, I am humbled and changed. In the face of your grief so immense that it seems a dying of sorrow right here before me, I am transformed in ways for which I have no words. In the face of your challenge not to ignore your despair by taking up easier problems, I am changed. In the face of your apparent wealth and privilege that awakens my rotten shame, I am changed. In the face of your history of violence and abandonment that reminds me of my own degradation, but also that we share a common humanity, I am changed. In the face of your soul murder by parents who unleashed their hatred and cruelty upon you, and who even now thwart all my capacity and desire to comfort and protect, I am humbled. In the face of your need and desire, child and adult, to be uniquely loved and cherished, and my own complex needs to love and to cherish as well as to be loved, I am challenged and changed. As a result of our personal meeting of the suffering of the patient, we shall be changed. Understanding all this, I owe first to my patients and secondarily to my beloved teachers and philosophers.
Thank you, Donna. Our three respondents this evening are the Seattle University faculty ambassadors for the Cura Psychologia project. Each are representing distinct disciplines, psychology, theology, and philosophy, but each of them also have careers defined by interdisciplinarity. We start with Dr. Kathleen Pape, who's a faculty member in the Seattle University Existential Phenomenological Psychology graduate program, where she teaches courses like therapeutic communications and reproductive justice and clinical mental health care. And she also supervises graduate students on internship. Her publications include Emerging into a World of Understanding, a hermeneutic exploration of perinatal mood disorders in clinical practice, and The Face of the Other in Motherhood. I haven't read that one and I really would like to. As a licensed clinical psychologist, Dr. Pape maintains a full-time private practice working with individuals and couples, as well as offering supervision and consultation. Kathleen.
Donna, thank you for your beautiful paper. Your descriptions of Levinas's and Lloydstrup's radical ethics inform a broader political and social way of being in the world that is of tremendous importance. I read your paper primarily from the point of view of a psychologist and psychotherapist, but I also read it as a person living in a city that is struggling mightily with its response to, as you described it, the stranger in the ditch or begging on the street as addressed to me. The impossibility of the demand confronts us here daily, and I think it does in many parts of this world. I want to focus my remarks on the intersection of the therapeutic encounter and the larger sociocultural context. Several psychologists have called our attention to how the therapeutic encounter reflects and can reinforce or resist social norms. And just to make a short list, in this paper, I'm thinking primarily of Phil Cushman, Lynn Layton, and the recently deceased Lane Gerber. Gerber, back in 1992, observed that clients are impacted by the external world, the political and social context in which they exist, Yet often they believe that those events, that context, is not a subject that should be discussed in therapy. Other than the political awareness of the early psychoanalysts, we've only recently in the discipline of psychology and psychotherapy begun to acknowledge that the patient and the therapist exist in a particular social, political, historical context, and that these are legitimate subjects to address in treatment. And just as an aside, all week since reading your, well, past few weeks since reading your paper, I've been thinking about the story of the Good Samaritan and whether someone was raised in a religious background or not. Pretty much everybody knows what a Good Samaritan is, and most states have Good Samaritan laws on the books. However, Good Samaritan laws are not on the books to force us to respond to somebody who is in need. Rather, they're there to protect someone from being prosecuted if they actually act on it. I think that gives us a sense of what radical ethics is up against in this current time period. In psychotherapy, the need to respond to the suffering other, and yet in Loikstrup's words, not to encroach on the other in the name of taking care, is a tenuous and difficult task. I have found this to be one of the most challenging parts of teaching and training graduate students in psychology and psychotherapy. How to let the client or patient have room in the therapeutic space, how to respond genuinely, but not intervene too early or too much or too perfunctorily, not to encroach. In truth, it has long been a growing edge in my own work as a therapist. Those of us who are called or choose psychotherapy as a profession have responded to a call to alleviate what pain they can for others. However, this desire, this calling can push a therapist to respond too soon, intervene too intrusively. It is necessary when working with survivors of complex trauma in particular, that the therapy be focused on them and their experience. Interpersonal trauma and abuse distorts relationships and forces the victim to constantly monitor their environment and to subjugate their own wants and needs to the demands of the abuser. Therefore, giving space and normalizing the attention given to the client's needs and desires is essential to therapeutic healing. However, with a particularly private and personal healing art, there is always the possibility of reinforcing a self-absorption or a self-contained individualism. In addition, an apolitical and uncritical psychotherapy can allow systems of oppression to remain unquestioned, taken for granted as the way things are. Gerber noted that, quote, our notion of self-contained individualism has created such a big separation between the outside world and the inside world that it seems almost impossible for clients and many psychotherapists even to think about their involvement in the outside world, whether they are in a therapy session or not. How can we use a psychotherapeutic space to encourage a radical ethics of responding to the other in our communities and still have it be a place of healing for the shattered souls needing safety and security? The critical psychologist Philip Cushman encouraged his students to include in their disclosure statements the following description of the therapy process. This is a little bit of a paraphrase. This is what's in my disclosure statement because I can't actually find Phil's. But I'm pretty sure I copied it word for word because I knew not to mess with his grammar. My therapy practice will provide you the opportunity to talk intimately with someone who is trained, learned, compassionate, and dedicated to understanding you and your struggles. As my client, I will challenge you and help you to think critically in order to help you discern your way through difficult times. My hope for all of my clients is that their compassion grows not only for themselves, but also for others and their communities, and that they learn to use their own wisdom as well as the wisdom of trusted others to guide them through the interpersonal and social problems of our time. Where does this wisdom come from, and who are these trusted others? And is it possible to prepare our clients for the one-sided demand called for by radical ethics? What you described on as this stupefying, excessive, exorbitant quality that defies the logic of justification. Well, we know that there are many sources of wisdom and many sources of trusted others, but the one I want to highlight this evening is actually literature. Near the end of my first year as a graduate student in this very Seattle U MA program, one of our beloved professors, Jan Rowe, announced to the class, if you want to learn about human experience, don't study psychology. Instead, read great literature and study history. This surprised us, not the least because we were already in a psychology program, supposedly learning about the human experience. But with each year that I've been in the discipline, her words resonate more and more for me. Psychological theory has vitally informed my work and my practice, no doubt. But when I come across complex and enigmatic aspects of human experience, I often find, if not necessarily guidance, at least resonance in literature. Interestingly, the three psychologists I mentioned at the beginning who recognized the social and therapeutic connections, Cushman, Leighton, and Gerber, all have degrees of some sort in English literature. Leighton is in comparative literature, and Lane and Phil were both English majors as undergraduates. The author, George Saunders, wrote a delightful exploration of Russian short fiction, if I can use delightful and Russian short fiction in the same sentence. It's entitled A Swim in a Pond in the Rain. The book discusses how those short stories guide questions of virtue, morals, and existence. In it, Saunders encouraged us to confine our expectations for fiction to this: reading fiction changes the state of our minds for a short time afterwards. He goes on to describe how our minds might be changed in particular ways. He says, I am reminded that my mind is not the only mind. I feel an increased confidence in my ability to imagine the experiences of other people and accept these as valid. I feel I exist on a continuum with other people. What is in them is in me and vice versa. And I feel more aware of the things in the world and more interested in them. Saunders goes on to describe how reading a story can disrupt one's certainty about the world, oneself, and one's views. He tells us, fiction helps us remember that everything remains to be seen. It is a sacrament dedicated to this end. We can't always feel as open to the world as we feel at the end of a beautiful story, but feeling that way, even briefly, reminds us that such a state exists and creates the aspiration in us to strive to be in that state more often. What Saunders describes sounds an awful lot like Stern's creative reformulations of experience. They both point to the opening and shifting that indicates changes of perspective, views, beliefs, and eventually behaviors in the therapeutic space, as well as the examination and maybe rejection or creation of meaning that sustains a purposeful life. Recently, I returned to the Russian writers of the 19th and early 20th centuries. I have the Cura to thank for that, with the death of Ivan Ilyich. I am currently reading Anna, okay, help me here, Karenina. Actually, I just heard it on Google, Karenina, so I'll just go with that, thank you. Or maybe rereading it, since I'm pretty sure it was assigned to me in high school or college, which is equivalent to the fact that I probably never read it. Every evening, I look forward to putting away the tasks of my day and settling into my fiction reading. A few nights ago, having just charged through several chapters in a sitting, the thought occurred to me, why do I care so much about what's happening to a bunch of 19th century fictional Russian aristocrats? Why do I care how Levin feels about mowing his meadow? Or how humiliated Dolly feels about her husband's philandering? Even more, why do I still like the character of her husband when he has so violated her trust? Aren't there some more pressing issues that I should be attending to now in my own time? What Tolstoy offers, however, is a recognizable description of how complicated and messy and beautiful and joyful life can be. Further, the characters demand my attention, or maybe Tolstoy's writing does. Either way, even though I can close the book at any time, but I tend not to. I stay with them. Even during the day when I am not reading, their stories circle around my mind. I care about their experiences of life and find myself caring more about what happens in my own life. Judith Herman has a beautiful quote in her book, Trauma and Recovery. She says, integrity is the capacity to affirm the value of life in the face of death, to be reconciled with the finite limits of one's own life and the tragic limitations of the human condition, and to accept these realities without despair. I was reminded that the first time I cried reading a book was when I thought the rabbit in Watership Down had died. I was called to dinner before I could get to the next chapter, and I'm pretty sure I was a holy terror at dinner and burst into tears. Turns out the rabbit lives, but I didn't know that. But it was the first experience of being so moved by issues of life and death, and I was a very young kid at this point. Stories can bring us from the self-contained individual back into the relational and the communal. They open us to new ways of responding to the stranger in the ditch or the one begging on the street, that decenters us, allows us to be changed. I'm proposing that a humanities-influenced discipline of psychology might develop practices in psychotherapy that reignite our capacity to be in the world and to care for it. They can, like the parable of the Good Samaritan, move us to mercy and compassion. Thank you.
That was wonderful. Thank you, Kathleen. Now I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Jeanette Rodriguez, who is a professor at Seattle University and teaches in the Department of Theology and Religious Studies, and also in the Couples and Family Therapy program. She serves as the director for the Institute for Catholic Thought and Culture and holds the Malcolm and Mary Stamper Endowed Chair in Catholic Intellectual and Cultural Traditions. As the director of ITCT, Jeanette enriches our campus community in remarkable fashion, bringing to Seattle a procession of incredible speakers and experiences that widens and deepens the cultural imagination of everyone wise enough to attend these events. Dr. Rodriguez is the author of several books and articles concentrated in areas in U.S. Hispanic theology, theologies of liberation, peace building, and women's spirituality. I particularly recommend to you her 2017 book, A Clan Mother's Call, which moved me to tears more than once as I read it. Maybe not Watership Down tears, but pretty close. Jeanette is also a licensed marriage and family therapist with specialties in Latinx health and wellness and justice-oriented therapy. Jeanette.
Well, hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Let's try that again. Buenos dias. Well, let me extend a very warm welcome to each and every one of you to our beautiful campus here at Seattle University in this glorious Pacific Northwest. Our elders tell us of this land that the words before all else are always words of gratitude. And so I want to extend my gratitude for your presence, for the insights offered by Dr. Donna Orange, especially her call for interdisciplinary conversation and dialogue, and the reflection of what it means to be human. Standard questions for all of our disciplines, psychology, theology, philosophy. And the strength of her paper is many, but I also believe that she recognizes the prevalence of the ego as a sickness. So we might ask what we've been witnessing, especially after COVID, this extreme loneliness, this hunger for power, this lording over and domination in all our relations, not just in our human relations, but in terms of our relationship to the earth. These are all symptoms of a deep sickness from having lost our capacity for flourishing human relations. And so we have to ask yourself if the priorities of a master culture sort of choke over and against the intercultural field of possibilities. So in my response, I'd like to focus on, I try to get it to the Jesuit 3, but I couldn't, 4 points that I'd like to just lift up and see if it's of interest to talk about and to ask questions. One has to do with what I call portals or doors, epistemological postures, how one enters, or by what lens do people take in the world, experience the world, respond to the world. Second point, I want to say something about this silent demand that you talk about in your paper. 3, I want to talk, you mentioned choices, but I want to say something about choiceless choices. And finally, I want to talk about what I see as inhibitors to this call for radical ethics that will change us. So there's a potential flourishing discourse that may emerge from these conversations, but of course, in the Western world, this is one portal, one perspective, brought forth. And as Dr. Orange noted, it's very individualized. No? The other day I was talking to a very close friend of mine, and we were talking about Levinas, and he reminded me of an interview that he had. You might remember this interview, where Levinas said, quote, "I often say, although it's a dangerous thing to say publicly, that humanity consists of the Bible and the Greeks, and all the rest can be translated. All the rest are exotic, is dance." So I guess he didn't have much interest, no, in the wisdom and the epistemology and the contributions to humanity that was made in all these other civilizations. That's not a critique, that's just a question, no? Could this lack of interest display an attitude of indifference or irrelevance in terms of worldviews that have been offered? Okay, so we begin thinking ethics is about my responsibility as it begins with me and the other tears it out of me. But what would happen if we began with ethics being about the priority of the other? You know, Buddhism, as well as Latin American culture, for example, are deep relational ontologies that make a contribution to the understanding of humanity. No? Sí or no? Okay. Okay. Point 2, silent demand. So we explore ethics and we look at our sources of understanding of ontology, of the commandments, of religious texts, of value systems. Is it possible to feel and experience this demand before they say anything? Right? Does their presence and their suffering impinge upon my comfort zone? So we see, for example, and we hear about the suffering of the war victims in Ukraine. They're not calling us. They're not saying, I need this or that you should do that. The poor of the world don't make this demand on us collectively. But many faith traditions tell us that the Creator or God is always trying to get us to pay attention to the scandal of unjust poverty, the deprivation of basic human rights, enough food to survive, decent housing, education, medical care, that are the daily reality about most of our brothers and sisters in the world. I think many North Americans forget that many of us do not live like you, right? 3/4 of the world do not live like us, no, here in North America. Cornel West tells us that, quote, we have to keep track at any given moment of who is bearing most of the social cost. This is what it means to look at the world from the vantage point of those below. I believe, he writes, in fact, that the condition of truth is to allow the suffering to speak. It doesn't mean that those who suffer have a monopoly on truth, but it means that the condition of truth to emerge must be in tune with those who are undergoing social misery. And a social misery, I want to say, that is an induced misery. It is socially induced forms of suffering. Not to dismiss or underestimate the power of the resilience in our humanity. No, I think a lot of times we tend to be trained to look at the problem, right? And look for us to give them the answers, and they look for the answers, no? To turn it around and to believe in the other's own resilience and wisdom is a very powerful tool, I think. Anyway, the poor, the marginalized, they're not making a demand on us. They don't even know us. They never met us, but the demand is silent. It pulls us out of our self-referential comfort zone. In many ways, it's what Ignacio Ellacuría talked about. How many of you know who Ignacio Ellacuría is? All right, he was the rector, the Jesuit rector of UCA, the University in Central America, in El Salvador. He was one of the 6 Jesuit martyrs, along with their housekeeper and her 15-year-old daughter. So Ellacuría spoke of this as well when he writes about the crucified peoples. He says, it's not enough to be present to the crucified people. Get them off the damn cross. Get the crucified people off the cross, is what he's saying, right? So the crucified people make such a demand by shedding light onto reality. Right? And there's a consequence for what we do and for what we don't do. We just have to decide if we can live with that consequence. 3, choiceless choice. So I wonder to what extent those communities under domination and oppression have choices. I appreciate the critique of individualism in Dr. Orange's paper, but I was waiting for something to be said about communitarian relationality. The world we live in would certainly be better and more humane if people, instead of being passive bystanders, assumed responsibility and acted on behalf of their fellow human beings in danger. However, the course of events, both in history and today, continuously demonstrates that this is easy to postulate as it is difficult to realize. So how would it be possible to minimize the number of bystanders and increase the number of helpers? How do individuals, institutions, states, organizations become, if we quote Simon Bauman, humane and ethical beings characterized by empathy and unselfishness when individual rationality points us in another direction? Jewish theologian David Novak has written that, quote, ethics primarily functions as the norm for humans in community, not for rational, self-legislating individuals, nor for this elusive humanity in general. The ecclesial identity and vocation of Christian ethics, because I'm a Christian theologian, does not imply an uncritical embrace of historic current moral practice of the churches. Quite the contrary, Christian ethics is and must always be relentlessly a critical discipline, rigorously examining practice and bringing this practice in dialogue with an understanding of the normative content of the Christian way of life. So those doing Christian ethics ask, what does it mean to be a Christian in this time and in this place? No? It is grounded in the belief or in the call, the recognition of the worth and the dignity and the basic rights of human beings and groups, and therefore requires the concrete practice of care on behalf of those that are threatened or vulnerable or in need. It's the same idea when we talk about freedom. The people, again, North Americans talk about freedom and equality without talking about equity, no? Or they talk about free, but I ask, free to do what? No? What is the poor person free to do, right? Do our relationships allow for this flourishing that we seek, that we aspire to? Do material conditions create the parameters with which any choice can be meaningful? Bueno. And then finally, inhibitors to this radical ethics for change, right? That's okay, I'll just read the question. So this first question is, how do we fill those empty places within ourselves, right? That's okay. There we go. Thank you. So here I look at addictions and attachments. The mystics talked in terms of attachments. Today we talk in terms of addictions to people, places, things that keep us stuck physically, emotionally, psychologically, spiritually. And these attachments are not necessarily material, physical things. We can be attached to being right? We can be attached to ways of being or perceiving, right? And the challenge or the problem with these attachments or these addictions, if you will, sometimes you're a workaholic. It's an addiction to be a workaholic, but you get atta girls or atta boys for that, right? So there are these addictions that you are get congratulations for, no? But the problem is that, like an addict, right? An addict is not capable of being in a relationship, right? So these attachments, right? These addictions, however you want to refer to them, stand in between the possibility of being intimate, right? All right. Another inhibitor, I think, is unrealized dreams and thwarted potentials. One of my favorite questions to my students is always, if you were guaranteed not to fail, what would you be doing, right? And then we go from there. Yeah. So I'll move a little bit quickly now. Isolation. How many of you remember the great German actress Marlene Dietrich? Yeah, my generation, the younger people might not know who she is, but she was known for a line that she would say all the time, which was, "I want to be alone," right? With that gesture, "I want to be alone." Do you know people like that? Things happen, they're hurt, they're angry, they're upset, lo que sea, and they want to be alone. Okay, but guess what? Healing doesn't happen alone. Healing happens in the eyes of the other, right? We know this, those of us who are doing clinical work, right? Because true authenticity requires that we drop our mask of composure, no? Emotional dishonesty is another one. I mean, I don't know about you, but I know people who lie even when they don't have to. Man, I'm not sure why they do that, right? So how can we be more emotionally honest? Undefined boundaries, is this my stuff or your stuff, right? Living in the past or our histories as we know it. This is why, big therapy right now is narrative therapy, helping people rewrite their stories. Both psychologically and spiritually, I think this resistance to the desert experience is an inhibitor, right? Allowing ourselves to experience our deepest pain is scary. We tend to run from it. And yet, this is how healing happens, no? The unwillingness or inability to examine our part in the conflict, misaligned integrity, lack of self-esteem. So these are just some of the inhibitors, and go in more detail. But I raise this question because I say to myself, wait a minute, we have Jesus, we have Gandhi, we have Martin Luther King, we have Mr. Rogers. It's like, so why aren't we being transformed? What's missing, right? So this is why I came up with this, right? So in conclusion, then, it's easy to see wonder as secondary to the work of justice and or healing. Right? What of wonder when the world is on fire or at war, right? Wonder is a revolutionary practice. Who we wonder about determines whose stories we let into our hearts, who we grieve with, right? Who we ultimately fight for. How many of you familiar with Valerie Kaur, the Sikh human rights activist? She has this beautiful thing that she writes about wonder. She says, wonder is the wellspring of love. And she says, let's define this. So she says, to wonder is to let in a sense of awe and openness and deep curiosity. It is to look upon the face of another or of anything and say, quote, you are a part of me I do not yet know. You are a part of me I do not yet know. It's an orientation to humility, right? Wondering about another person, their thoughts, their experiences, their pains, their joys, their needs, their wants. It gives us information of how to love them. It's how we've learned how to love our partners, our children, our friends. When we wonder about people we would otherwise see as strangers and let even them inside our circle of care, then wonder becomes a revolutionary act. So, que viva la revolución, and thank you very much.
Both Plato and Aristotle can be quoted saying that philosophy begins in wonder. I don't know that they meant it the way you said it, but they'd be better off had they. Our final respondent is Dr. Jerome Veit, who I'm tempted to simply introduce as a warm and generous friend. He's more than that too, but I can't think of a better accolade than warmth and generosity and friendship. Jerome is a longtime member of the philosophy faculty here at Seattle University, as well as a practicing psychotherapist here in Seattle. He also frequently teaches for the Masters of Arts in Psychology program and in the honors program here at Seattle University. He's a creative and innovative teacher and interdisciplinary scholar. He works in interdisciplinary ways, both in the core and for the psychology and philosophy majors here. His class, Memory and Violence, guides students into deep and impactful encounters with the role of narrative and history and memory. Jerome piloted a brand new course recently called Philosophy and Psychology, demonstrating his capacity to stand with one foot firmly planted with authenticity and depth in each world. And students love the course. Right, Snow, you take the course? His monograph on Gadamer's philosophy moved scholarship on Gadamer in the direction of virtue and ethics, and particularly the virtue of openness. I would say a lot more about that remarkable book, which didn't make me cry, Sorry, Jerome, but it's really very good. But I'd really rather give Jerome the mic, and you can ask me about his book later. Go ahead, Jerome.
Perfect. Thanks, Eric. And thank you, Donna, for such a thought-provoking talk. I fear my comments aren't nearly gonna resonate the way the previous two respondents did, but there will be some parallels and echoes, I hope. What I want to say first is just how clearly I think we see demonstrated tonight the power that the intersection of doing philosophy with rich clinical depth can be, and vice versa. Just how so powerfully informed. It's just so palpable that your work, Donna, is informed by all of the thinkers that you've studied, and there's so many. So I'm honored just to be in the same room, let alone responding to your work. I've used your writings in countless courses, and I continue to turn to it just for guidance as a therapist and also as a teacher. Being a beginner on Levinas, however, and with Lugstrup being completely foreign to me prior to this paper, I'll spare you my stumbling thoughts on those two thinkers that are at play here. I have, however, taught plenty of ethics courses that feature Aristotle, and at times I've considered virtue ethics the best we've got as far as articulable moral theories go. So I'd like to offer a few ways that I still take virtue concepts to be relevant in ways that I also hear them to be resonant in the talk we've heard this evening. And I also want to pose the possibility that this challenges the notion hinted at in your paper, Donna, that we can go or have gone beyond virtue ethics. I'm certainly sympathetic to some kind of need of critiquing the virtue ethics tradition. It might be more, though, that I'm wary of pitfalls in interpreting Aristotle and virtue ethics. On one end of the spectrum, I see the issue of traditionalism and hearing virtue ethics with this traditionalist ring to it of needing to be a certain set way and having this catalog of characteristics that one needs to somehow simply imbue from the past and carry forward. For those who long for that traditionality, and there are plenty of Aristotelians and virtue ethicists who still do, the nature of the human, and thus our telos, is often considered to be something settled, a settled question that's perhaps simply gotten covered over or forgotten, and that is simply in need of reassertion or rediscovery. So that's one end of the spectrum on which I see issues with interpreting virtue ethics. On the other end, in a completely different tone, we have the issue of relativism. And you've alluded to this, Donna, that if virtue is fulfillment, and that's all we characterize it as, and the latter is interior to a contextless subject and gets to be defined by that subject in whatever way they wish, then yeah, virtue becomes whatever one prefers, whatever makes one happy, as most undergrads tend to think the first time they read Aristotle. Oh yeah, I get virtue ethics, totally. Yeah, it's just what I already do. So here I think this is an obvious issue with interpreting this tradition, but the issue there isn't always as clear. I think we see the language of this creeping into discourses of self-realization, discourses of things like happiness studies or positive psychology. I think these are often used in contextless ways to justify what we've already inherited, whatever the culture is in which those versions of this are being practiced. As Kathleen already articulated, this becomes problematic in the practice of therapy. If we're simply helping a client to thrive, to cope, to self-realize just for themselves, but disregarding what their surroundings might be pulling them towards, and all the ways that that might require deep change, might require deep discernment or co-discernment, as I so powerfully hear in the works of Gerber and Cushman. So both of these are misreadings and they fall at extremes. So in good Aristotelian fashion, I would recommend some kind of middle here, which very broadly construed could be a recognition of context, a recognition of our already shared practices, our already inherited cultural norms, ideals, narratives. And it's always the risk of thinking that virtue is just going to be doing well in that context or doing well with those inherited patterns and norms. But it's never as stable, contained, or automatic as this implies. And I think this is a real subtext of Aristotle. I would have to go back and study him more to really lift this out. Luckily, others have done this for us. But this is the point that virtue isn't mere rule following. It's also not an attainment. This is something that Aristotle's really clear on. We're not finished pursuing virtue. Happiness isn't an achievement. It's a process. It's a doing, not a result. So it's an ongoing dialogical attending and responding to one's situation. It may demand that one resist one's tradition or the community's way of doing things. I think this is where so many contemporary virtue ethicists are adamant that, and as Jeanette just mentioned, right, that to be a Christian, for example, is to be a Christian today. It's not to be the Christian of 2,000 years ago, as if that were even possible. So it begs the question of what that is, what that would entail or could entail. I think this explains the fleeing in the other direction, the fleeing in the direction of relativism or individualism, where virtue might look like an inner state, if only we can detach from our context in which we arise. We can zoom in on aspects of ourselves, like our affects, like our motivations, like our aspirations or desires. It can seem as if we're doing the work of Aristotle's ethics there. But I think as the point about friendship that he spends quite a bit of time on for a good reason is that person is there to remind us that we're being self-centered, that we're getting way too self-involved if we think that's the path of virtue, if we think that's what humaning well entails. So all of this, again, to highlight this notion of context, all of this takes place against the backdrop of wider influence and movements. Understanding which way we're pulled, where this pull comes from, how we are to respond, this requires deliberation. And that deliberation may be with oneself. I think one should learn that. That's part of what I hope I help clients do in therapy is hear what's going on in themselves and hear how they're already speaking to themselves and don't notice that. It's also, however, deliberation with others. And those others can be real or imaginary, past or present. And these are the major resonances that I hear both in your talk, Donna, and in the responses so far, that this exit from the self, this sortie du soi, that we hope will become a habit, that we hope would be a mature posture that we always carry with it, and that's always leaning forward into the next possibilities and what will be asked of me. This is something that can't be taught simply by reading about it or simply being told that this is a demand on me and, okay, live up to it. Aristotle seems right to notice that these sorts of accounts often serve merely as reminders for what the virtuous are already inclined to strive for, what they've already in some way committed to. And that striving itself can't be inculcated with mantras, rules, codes, or logic. So to hone my virtue of responding, I have to see how it's possible. I have to get a glimpse. And this requires role models, living or dead, others whose responsivity I can trace and perhaps thereby come to sense in an embodied way, in a way that I can hear parallels to in my own life, in which I can maybe adopt the gaze or adopt the listening and attend as they did. All right, a few more points. So to borrow your phrase, Donna, yes, perhaps only stories allow this tracing and teaching. At times I would be inclined to agree that there's certainly something powerful about narrative, about literature in bringing us to this and in showing us things. But these also don't exist simply ready-made. I think this is why we wonder about curriculum and revise the curriculum. It's not just a shelf of the same books, or it might be the same books, but we might want to hear different things at different times, or have someone else read them to us. So yes, we can and should ask, deliberate, one might say, about who counts, what stories should be heard when and why. But I'm also not entirely sure that it's only stories. I want to put a word in for poetry here to say something non-narrative, but that uses language, pushes the limits of language, pushes the limits of understanding, pushes the limits of perception. In effect, I want to say we need all the help we can get to perceive and find ways of responding. So perhaps that's what's included in stories. I'm inclined to stretch narrative quite broadly in my own understanding, but I sense that there's something of necessity to really hear these edges, these limits. And this leads me to the strongest virtue ethics resonance that I've heard in this talk, which is the notion of solidarity. And this type of obligation, if we think of solidarity as the duty to respond, as this demand, this type of obligation I've always thought of as being synonymous with virtue ethics. This obligation of solidarity, it comes from this contextual framework. It underscores that to experience solidarity is to be encumbered. This is the language of many virtue ethicists and communitarians. It's to be encumbered with unchosen obligations. These are things I don't agree to as a contract. I don't first sign something and then carry out my ethical duty. I've been obligated prior to that choice or that agreement. But those obligations are towards one shares some kind of particular bond with. In other words, solidarity isn't universal, or it isn't merely universal, I guess, in that abstract sense of, yes, it's to all in the same ways. These bonds of solidarity can be political, religious, ethnic, economic, or otherwise. And perhaps they're dependent for their force on some kind of grounding narrative, on something by which I'm included in them, something that reminds me of my inclusion in that community. And thus the scope of solidarity is variable over time and place. We might even say that there are intersectional solidarities. I don't just have a solidarity, I have plural solidarities. And all of this raises a culminating question and a concern that I just felt arising throughout this piece. The question is, to echo what Jeanette asked, where is the we in radical ethics? That's the way I phrased it. And the concern underlying that question is that Loegstrup and Levinas are, in some ways, contrary to this language of resisting individualism, actually highly individuating, right? This is that isolating component that you highlighted, Donna, that the demand isolates me. And yet, are we ever so isolated? I guess that's the concern, is wondering to what degree this isolates me too much, leaves me in a space of being so pulled, so burdened, so aware of the incompleteness of my response. Perhaps I'm thinking from a clinical standpoint of the thing we're always worried about, which is burnout, and that one of the solutions or ways we're to prevent burnout is to connect, seek connection, seek consultation, recharge, as they say, right? But these are always going to happen, not in isolation. They're going to happen in some form of community, in some form of relating. So in conclusion, what I want to offer here is that perhaps in pursuing radical ethics, perhaps we need to go beyond virtue ethics. But to me, it sounds more like we're jumping at least off from virtue ethics, that we're carrying something forward of this tradition. We're asking how to be virtuous, how to human well, how to respond well and attend well. And if the radicality of the ethical response lies in resisting certain parochial forms of solidarity, certain entrenched or ossified forms of response, then yes, we should challenge those. We should ask what it could mean to respond otherwise. Most of all, though, and this echoes perhaps some of the work of MacIntyre, we also need spaces in which to wonder these things together, whatever they may be. We have to cultivate and uphold the institutions that foster the practices that will end up making virtue possible. Thank you.
I'd like to think that this lecture is precisely that, as well as the days ahead, the opportunity to foster the kinds of rich, deep, meaningful conversations that lead us to the concrete manifestations of solidarity as it exists in between one another and, of course, for the poor. Okay, thank you so much for attending tonight. This is a delightful event, and we've enjoyed your company, and we've run out of time, so we won't be doing the circulation of the mic. Welcome to those of you who are here for the next couple of days. This is the beginning of some conversations. For those of you who joined us online, make sure you get your CEUs through Mookie and Darby, I believe. And thank you, everyone, for being here. Event dismissed.